Hello and welcome to another DazToHue tutorial video. This time we're going to take a look at how we can use the materials that are included with DazToHue release 1.2 inside Unreal Engine. And in particular we'll be taking a look at the skin material that's included. Now I've been reluctant to record this tutorial even though it's one of the most requested from DazToHue users. The reason I'm reluctant is because I'm not particularly an expert in Unreal Engine materials. There's a lot of sort of theory, a lot of different parts that goes into texturing and materials and UVs and render buffers, etc., in Unreal Engine. And it all felt a bit daunting trying to put it together a tutorial. The second reason I've been a bit reluctant to do this is because, there's far better teachers out there for all of this sort of thing. You'll find a ton of information on the internet on how UVs and textures and materials and all that are related. And I don't want to delve too deep into any of that in this tutorial. So instead, I'm going to focus on pretty much how I go about texturing or creating materials for my characters in Unreal Engine using the DazToHue skin material. We will touch a little bit on sort of theory along the way, but hopefully not get too deep because this tutorial is primarily aimed at beginners. So the end result, once we've sort of finished through this tutorial series, it won't be the most optimized material you can have, but I deliberately built the skin material such that it could be used by people who didn't have a lot of experience in any of this. And really you can get away with just dropping a color texture into the material to get reasonable looking results, but we're going to take it a bit further as well. Okay, so to get started here, I just have this Genesis 9 figure in Daz Studio. The only preparation I've done so far is that I've loaded the standard G9 ROM onto it. The character and the clothing are both set to subdivision level 1. Now, before we export, I am just going to do one thing to this Genesis 9 tier geometry. If we zoom in on the eyes, that's this wetness line that appears around the eyes. Now, DazToHue ships with a copy of the lacquerable fluid material that comes with MetaHumans. That's the material that is used to give this sort of wetness look around the eyes. The problem is that the UVs or the UV layout that material in Unreal Engine expects are very different to what Daz provides. So what I'm going to do is load a preset onto this tier line geometry to just correct those UVs into a layout that's close to what the MetaHuman tier material expects to have. So with the Genesis 9 tier selected, if I go to DazToHue, UVs, Genesis 9, and I'm going to double click on this Genesis 9 tier. By default, nothing's changed other than if I go to the surfaces, click on Genesis 9 tier and scroll right down to the bottom, we'll see UV set. And now if I expand that, we'll have an option for UE5. So I'm going to select that. Now that will make the tier look wrong in Daz Studio, and it will also look wrong in Houdini, but it should look right when we bring it into Unreal Engine, which we'll have a look at later. So with that done, I'm going to export this character as both an animated FBX and an alembic cache. I've showed this process before in previous videos, so I'm not going to cover it again here. So instead we'll jump over to Houdini and begin working on it there. So here we are with our character inside of Houdini, and I've already gone ahead and prepared pretty much everything on this character other than the materials and UVs. That will be the focus of this video. One thing I will just point out is on the import node, I've gone ahead and deleted the left and right eye geometry from both the FBX and Alembic because I will be using the included Unreal Engine eye shader, which doesn't require that part of the character's geometry. So now let's take a look at the materials node. The first thing I'm going to do is set up our eye geometry. So for Genesis 9 figures on the eyes tab, I just need to select the eye moisture left and right geometry. And I'll just quickly turn on wire shading and make sure that that crosshair is perfectly lined up with our pupil, which it is. And that's all we need to do to get the eyes working in Unreal Engine. Now, you don't have to use the included eye shader. If your character is more cartoon based, you can ignore this step. But if you're going for a realistic looking character, I highly recommend you use the eye shader, as it is basically a copy of the MetaHuman eye shader with a couple of small changes. It's highly versatile in terms of the parameters you can set on it, and well worth taking a look at, as I say, if you're going for a more realistic looking character. So now let's move on to our materials. The first thing I'm going to do is click this auto populate materials button. What that will do is bring in all of the materials that are already on our character. So these are the surface names that were exported out of Daz Studio. And the first step I like to take is to think about how we can optimize the total number of materials that we're ultimately going to end up with in Unreal Engine. Now, because this is a beginner's tutorial, I'm not going to go as far as creating things like texture atlases. I normally would create a texture atlas that included the body, head, arms, and legs, for example, and that would get 4 materials down to 1 for that part of the character. But like I say, because this is aimed at beginners, we are going to do it in a way that doesn't really require any manipulation of textures. But there are still some opportunities to consolidate some of these. So I know from experience on Genesis 9 figures that the fingernails and toenails, for example, share the same texture, and they will use the same material type in Unreal Engine. So there's really no need to have 2 separate materials for the fingernails and toenails. There's a couple of ways you can sort of work this stuff out. One is to look at the character in Daz Studio, look at the surfaces and see which textures each surface is using. If they are using the same textures, then there's a good chance you can get away with just one material for all of them. I can also come up to this textures drop down and select the nails, for example, and locate that texture, and then have a look at it. And I can tell just by looking at this texture that we have both the fingernails and toenails in this single texture sheet. So a good candidate for consolidation are these two. So what I'm going to do under the toenails is merge with the fingernails. That will delete the toenails, merge it in with the fingernails, and now I'm just going to rename it to just nails. The legs, this time I will keep as a separate material. Again, I know from experience that the mouth cavity on Genesis 9 is part of the head texture. So for the mouth cavity, I'm going to merge with the head. Head and the body I'll leave as is, as separate. Now you could have separate materials for left and right eye if you wanted to get really detailed and have, for example, different vein maps on each eye, but I'm not going to go to that level this time. So what I will do is merge the right eye in with the left eye, and then I'll find that and just rename it to eyes. The teeth and the mouth typically go together, so I'll merge the teeth in with the mouth. The tear line or lacrimal fluid has its own material type in Unreal Engine, so it needs to be its separate material, sorry. And we're pretty much left with the clothing now, which I will keep as separate. I will just rename them, so I'll call it clothing bottom and clothing top. Now if we come up to isolate and just double check we've captured everything, so we have our new material definitions here. You can see we started with 14 materials, we're now down to 10. And like I said, we could go further if we went into the sort of texture atlas path, but for this tutorial, I will leave it at that. So now let's talk about UVs and texture painting outside of Houdini. So what I'll do is split the screen to bring up our UV layout. These are the UVs as they come exported out of Daz. For my own workflow, I never import a figure into Unreal Engine with UDIMs. I've never come across a scenario where I needed UDIMs inside of Unreal Engine, and you will run into issues with precision. That is, the further these UV islands move away from the 0 to 1 space, the less precise they become in Unreal Engine, and it is noticeable on the textures in Unreal Engine. You can get around that by enabling, I think it's called the Use Precise UVs when you're importing the character in Unreal Engine. That does come at a small performance cost. And like I say, I've never come across a scenario where I've needed to have UDIMs in Unreal Engine. So for the character, or for the version of the character that I bring into Unreal Engine, I always pack my UV islands into this first 0 to 1 space. And to do that, under the UV tab, I'd add a single UV operation, and that would be move all to first UDIM. So this is the version of the character, of the UVs that I would bring into Unreal Engine. If, for whatever reason, you were determined to have UDIMs on your character in Unreal Engine, there is one important thing to point out, which is that the UVs for the eyes must always be in the 0 to 1 space if you're wanting to use the the Unreal Engine eye shader. It won't work if the UVs aren't in that 0 to 1 space. It does some complicated maths that assumes that the UVs are in that 0 to 1 space, so if they are anywhere else, it won't work. To enable UDIMs, what I typically do is add a different UV operation, and this one I'll use auto split across UDIMs. And what that will do is for each of our materials we've defined, it will place them in their own separate UDIM tile. You can control the number of columns that it packs them into. Now, as I said, if I was determined to export this figure into Unreal Engine with UDIMs, then I would want to make sure at the very least that this eye UVs are in the 0 to 1 space. And to do that, they need to be at the top of this list. So if I went right down to the bottom, clicked this button to move them to the top, then now the eye shader would work in Unreal Engine with UDIMs enabled. But like I say, I never import my character into Unreal Engine with UDIMs. However, there are other valid reasons for wanting UDIMs, and one of those is if you are planning to export the character to do something like texture painting in Substance Painter. In that scenario, you would certainly want UDIMs. And so don't be afraid to export different versions of your character for different purposes, basically. And there is a dedicated export option for just that. So with our UDIMs enabled, if I wanted to paint on this character in Substance Painter, I can click this Export a Static Mesh option. And that will do just that. It will export a static copy of this character, so it's much smaller than the one that has all the morph targets and everything baked in. You don't want to try and import that version into Substance Painter. You want this static mesh version. So now if I have a look at our export directory, we can see we have this STM-KD9, and that is a static version of this character with these UDIMs applied. So if I bring that into, say, Substance Painter, you can see now we have our UDIM layout that we had in Houdini, and we can now freely paint across UDIMs, which is the way I typically do it. It is possible to bring in the character's original textures under this scenario. You do need to name the files in a certain way so that Substance Painter understands which texture goes with which UDIM tile. But that's not something I'm going to cover in this tutorial. You'll find information about that in the Substance Painter documentation. There is another way to do it, which is to have separate texture sets for each UDIM. That is easier to bring the original files into, but it means you can't paint across UV tiles with that. So you can't paint across texture sets. To do that, again on the material node, if we click on the shaders button, we need to generate a separate shader for each of our materials. That's the only way that Substance Painter will recognize them as separate texture sets. So we just need to click this Generate Shaders button, and that will create a material network that's basically created Houdini shaders for each of our materials. Now if we export a static mesh again, and then bring this version into Substance Painter, You'll now see that we have separate texture sets for each of our materials inside Substance Painter. And you'll see we still have the UV layouts that we had before. But as I say, now they are separate textures, which means you can't easily paint across texture sets. So they're the two different ways of exporting out for texture painting. We don't need these shaders for Unreal Engine, so I'm going to remove them. And let's get back to focusing on exporting this character for Unreal Engine. So I'm going to go back to my UVs and I'm going to move them all back to the first UDIM. And really, that's all we need to do. One other thing to point out is that the order the materials are defined here will also be the order that they appear on your skeletal mesh in Unreal Engine. I've only ever found one instance where the order mattered, and it was to do with eye occlusion geometry and tear lines. I won't get into it now. We'll cover that in a later tutorial, but it's pretty rare that the order matters really in Unreal Engine. So with our materials defined, our UVs packed into the 0 to 1 space, we're now going to export this character